Hi, I'm James Dunn. Welcome to the Inside Network.
Joining us today from London to discuss de-risking portfolios through decarbonisation is Stephanie Maier, the Global Head of Sustainable and Impact Investment, responsible for leading GAM Sustainable and ESG Strategy. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Let's first start with the terminology. We talk about sustainable, ethical, responsible. I guess ESG has been added. What is GAM's approach and what is the best way to actually describe what we're trying to achieve?
Yeah, so certainly, this field is not short of terminology, not short of acronyms. And certainly, the period I've been in the business, those words and the terms that we tend to use have changed over time. And, what we're seeing now as well is that some of those terms are also getting more regulatory definitions around them, and we're seeing standards build around them. I think, our focus is really on sustainability, sustainable investment. From a holistic view, what is it that enables companies to endure and to prosper? Well, it's those companies that are really taking a more holistic view at their impact on environment, on society, those companies that are well governed. So, essentially, it's around, how do we approach all of those ES and G factors to deliver not just on the investment outcomes, but also looking at the the broader impact on the environment and society as well.
You've recently attended the COP26 summit, and you hold various roles, such as being a founding committee member for Climate Action 100+. What is the real impact that these events and groups actually have? And can you share some of the takeaways that you had out of COP26?
Yeah, certainly. So obviously we're still in the midst of much ink being written about whether it's a success, whether it was a failure. I think what's important to recognize is that it's a really important multilateral process. We did see some really strong commitments. We saw US China commitment and statement coming through. We saw further pledges for decarbonisation. So we did see a ratchet of ambition, which is what Paris was designed to deliver, this period sort of 5 or, because of coronavirus, 6 years on from Paris. So I think we did see progress on the sort of national commitments that were made. One of the things that I think was really different this time at Glasgow was really how central the private sector is. I think there's certainly, this was the COP that the private sector definitely came to the table. Companies talking about net zero, decarbonisation, not driven primarily by regulation, but driven by recognition that this is something that they need to do. And also something that in many sectors their customers, their client base are asking them to do as well. So I think that was a really important sort of development, because we will absolutely need policy and regulation alongside the private sector actors, private sector finance, to help deliver on the goals of Paris and of Glasgow. When we look at organisations and collaborations like Climate Action 100+, so it's one of the largest investor collaborations on climate change. There again, we launched that in December 2017. Since then, we've seen focused on 160 of the largest greenhouse gas emitters. We released our net zero benchmark in March earlier this year. And we've already seen a significant number of companies, around a third, make those long-term net zero commitments. Now, clearly, what we're focused on now is, how do you illustrate that those targets, those commitments are actually going to be delivered? So, we're measuring things like shorter term targets, medium term targets, where the capex is aligned, how the board is incentivized to help deliver on that decarbonisation as well. So I think we have seen real progress, but absolutely a huge amount more to do. And another thing coming out of COP26 was again the sort of renewed sense of urgency and need for action.
Well, following on from that, it would appear, certainly from our point of view, it seems that Europe has actually been ahead of the curve in terms of embracing carbon emissions, carbon reductions. Has the private sector in Europe been ahead of the government, and have you been able to show already that it's making a meaningful difference?
So I think, within Europe, there's already a very, progressive policy and regulation, both around decarbonisation in terms of the targets that the EU has set, and the kind of broader policies, including around biodiversity, circular economy, etc., that have been put in place to help support those measures. So I think it's clear that within Europe we already do have a well-articulated policy framework on a number of these issues. What we've also seen, though, is the private sector, and talking about both the corporate and the financial side, actually making some really I think important strategic decisions around what the the future of their sectors are going to look like. So I think also we've got an investor base that's been engaging, and corporates that are used to being engaged with on a range of environmental, social and governance topics, including climate change. But one of the advantages and the necessities really of engaging through the collaborative initiatives is that we need action in all regions. It's not just, and it can't be just driven in Europe. And I'd say it isn't just a European phenomenon. We've seen in Asia very significant support for green finance. If you look at things like green bond issuance, so this is certainly something that I think is something that is being mobilized globally and needs to be.
Companies can source renewable energy directly, or they can buy carbon credits, and amongst other options. Do you judge how decarbonisation is being achieved, and are you comfortable by the way of the methodology with which emissions are actually being reported, and what improvement would you like to see?
Yeah, so it does matter how decarbonisation is achieved, and there's been a lot of rightly a lot of kind of focus on how the use of carbon credits. Now the challenge is there is the quality, the permanency of carbon credits that are used, but importantly that they should only be used for the very last proportion of emissions reduction. So the bulk of any decarbonisation should be linked to how you actually reduce those emissions within operations or through the supply chain as well. So I think rightly there is a focus on how companies are decarbonising, and in particular scrutiny on the use of carbon credits as well, because ultimately what we're looking for is that real world reduction in emissions, not just a sort of a transference. Your other question was around the sort of measurement of carbon, and I think this has been one of the areas that we've seen relatively quite fast progress on. So it was only just after the Paris Agreement in 2015, early 2016, that the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures was set up. So this being the framework to voluntarily disclose against how climate-related risks are governed, the strategy that's in place, the risk management measures, and then the specific metrics and targets. since then, what we've seen now is, in multiple markets, that becoming, moving from the voluntary to mandatory reporting aligned with TCFD. And one of the announcements on the Climate Finance Day during COP within UK was that they are looking to have transition plan reporting from companies as well. So obviously, taking TCFD framework and encouraging further reporting around how companies are in fact planning to transition in line with net zero. So we've seen a lot of I think improvement in data. I think the fact that data is being used by investment, for investment decision making, is also putting scrutiny on the quality of that data. But we still have challenges around scope 1 and 2, so that the main sort of direct emissions tend to be reported much better than the scope 3, so those upstream or downstream emissions, which can be equally, if not more important for certain sectors where the bulk of their emissions occur outside the direct the direct sort of factory gates, as it were.
And that's a follow on, is how far really is a company's responsibility actually lie in terms of its customers as potential emitters, even if it may have, in the service industry, I guess it's very prevalent that they are low emitters, but their customers were well behind emitters, or the methodology of getting the product to the customer is a higher emitter. Do you think they have a responsibility to that? Should they include that in their emission statement sufficiently so that they should offset those?
Well, I think, taking a step back, what are we trying to achieve? And it's decarbonisation of the of the entire economy. It's not just one sector; it's all sectors, and those sectors interrelate as well. So I think this point about scope 3 is incredibly important, and certainly when we're looking at for example, auto sector, it is important, the emissions associated with the use of their product, for example, the car, which is why we're seeing, and again, there's a statement at COP, both by countries and some auto manufacturers around, essentially this phasing phasing out of the conventional combustion engine and moving to electric vehicles. So I think in there we definitely see the product is inextricably linked to the emissions in the use of that product as well. So I think it certainly makes sense for for companies to be looking both up and down the supply chain, both in terms of opportunities to decarbonize, but also opportunities to build resilience into their supply chains and their value chains as well. We talk a lot and focus rightly on the transition risk part of climate risk, but we mustn't forget the physical risks as well. And we're already seeing more extreme climate related weather events. So I think that resilience piece and that that full value chain view is incredibly important.
Do you favor an engagement approach or an exclusion? I mean, by way of example, companies that are high emitters but are making a big effort to reduce them may make a bigger difference to the overall level of emissions compared to those that never really had any emissions in the first place.
Yes, I think this is a really key point about the transition. So how are we going to transition to net zero? So obviously there are certain companies that are there, that are there already in terms of they're part of those solutions. So whether that's renewable energy or technology that's enabling greater energy efficiency in other processes. So we do need to, and we do look at those opportunities, those investment opportunities, those companies that are going to benefit because they are part of the solution, part of being enabling and driving that transition. However, we also have, large sectors in the economy that will need to persist. We still need energy, but how do we decarbonize that over time? And there we, may be invested in high emitters, but it is, and we do engage with those high emitters to focus and support the delivery of their decarbonisation, knowing that it's going to take longer. It's going to take longer for for cement manufacturers, for steel manufacturers to scale up the technologies to decarbonize their or at least lower the carbon in their products. So it's we need to look at both the opportunities and those companies that need to transition. And I suppose your question around the kind of exclusion piece, we do we things like coal that clearly need to be phased out. That is again something that we look at, well, how quickly are those is any exposure to coal being phased out. But again, you look at energy companies, a number of companies will have coal as a small part of their energy mix. They're ramping up their renewable proportion of energy generation. Those companies in many cases have very large capex plans to increase renewable energy generation, even though they currently have a proportion of their generation by coal. But where there's a very clear and timely kind of phase out plan, where there's no new coal, then those companies also need support in that transition.
Thank you, Stephanie. This is the Insight Network. We've been speaking to Stephanie Maier, who leads GAM's sustainable and ESG strategy. Thank you very much for those insights.
Thank you.